Okay, welcome back. We're going to finish chapter one, and we're going to talk about the 7 ingredients of a crime. These are in your textbook, chapter one still. And what we're going to talk about is, let me back up for a second. So what we're focusing on is that in order for something legally to be considered a crime, it has to meet these 7 requirements. Okay, for a behavior to be considered a crime, or for a situation to be considered a criminal situation, it has to meet these 7 requirements. And as we go through them, they're probably going to seem pretty common sense to you, but I think, especially for those who are interested in going to law school, you need to have an understanding of this. So let's go. Why am I pausing? I'm not pausing. All right. Sorry, guys. All right. The first one is the act requirement. Essentially, the act requirement is just what it is. It is the idea that thought is not a crime. All crime requires a human act. And that is, what is that human act? It is a conscious interaction between mind and body that results from effort of the actor. Okay? Conscious interaction between mind and body that results from the effort of the actor. Okay? It is a voluntary act. And when we talk about the act requirement, if I decide to go out and steal a television tonight, and it's still light out, but in an hour or so it's going to be dark, and my neighbors have nice stuff. I may decide to go get one of their TVs. That'd be kind of sweet. I could sell it at the pawn shop or on Craigslist. That's an act. I decided to break into their house and take their television, and then pawn it and sell it, fence it on Craigslist, which is actually where most stolen goods are sold, is Craigslist. So that part would be considered an act. Now, irrational behavior isn't counted toward the act requirement. But we're going to skip that for right now because we're going to do a whole chapter on criminal defense in the third module of this course. But right now, let's just focus on any crime requires an actual physical act. Okay, so why is this important? It's because we can't criminalize someone's status. We can only criminalize their act because we have attempted to criminalize status in the past. So, a famous case, Robinson versus the state of California. This is a 1962 case. It's an 8th Amendment case in the Supreme Court. California tried to criminalize being a drug addict. And so, the idea was that if you were, a drug addict, you were therefore a criminal, and you could be put in jail just for being an addict. And that's what happened to this person, Robinson. And the Supreme Court basically ruled that this law was unconstitutional because you were punishing somebody because of their status as a drug addict, not for their actions. You had to catch them buying the drugs and using them, as opposed to just being an addict and locking them up. Some people have argued that the same law applies to the idea that we were going to ban Muslims from coming into this country. Was that also an 8th Amendment case? All right. Now, failure to act can also be considered a crime if you fail to do something you were legally required to do. So one case here would be if you are required to register as a sex offender and you fail to do so, you can be arrested and put back in jail. That is failure to act. Okay, so the act requirement either requires a conscious act or the failure to do something you're supposed to do. Now, normally in this class, I get asked about, we do face-to-face, usually get asked about what, these ideas of the Good Samaritan law. So, if you're riding down the road and you see a wreck and somebody looks hurt, are you obligated to stop and help them? And the answer is no. You actually are not obligated to stop and help them. In fact, only 2 states criminalize have Good Samaritan laws, Vermont and Minnesota. No one's really ever been successfully persecuted and or prosecuted. I can tell you a horrible story from my life. My youngest brother was a physician, and he had just graduated from med school back in '93, and we were in New Orleans celebrating, and we were just kind of, it was the next day. We were just kind of out walking around. We were down at Jack's Brewery, and my wife and my brother and my wife's parents were there, and we were all just kind of having a good time. And we went to a food court in Jack's Brewery down on Canal Street, and we saw some woman that was choking on like a French fry or something. And so we all looked at my brother. We said, "You need to go over there and help her. You're a doctor." And he looked at us. I said, "I'm not going over there to help her. For one thing, she's not choking. She's still breathing. And two, if I go over there and do something, if I do the Heimlich on her, I'm going to break her sternum and she's going to sue me." First thing they taught us in med school: don't get involved in cases that you don't, that aren't directly assigned to you. So anyhow, horrible story. Our brother's a better person than that now. Back then, maybe not. All right. Second and third, legality and harm requirements. We'll combine these two together. So an act must be made criminal by law before it is committed, and there has to be what's called actus reus, or the presence of a harmful act. Okay? So one case, Palandreno versus the state of New Jersey in 1970. There used to be, most of the United States law is based on English common law. And there used to be a statute that carried over from colonial times where it was illegal to be a common scold. Which a common scold is basically an argumentative woman. And a woman had been arrested under this common scold statute for arguing with the police. And her last name was Palandreno. She was not ultimately put in prison because she argued with the police, although it's never really a smart idea. So in terms of the harm act, the harm must occur before the act is accomplished. So John Hinckley is a Texan. He is a graduate of, he did not graduate from Texas Tech. He attended Texas Tech. He might be a graduate of Highland Park. I'm not sure. But I know that it was a well-known school in Dallas. I think it's Highland Park. Anyhow, John Hinckley's most famous for having shot President Reagan right after his inauguration. I think it was 1981 in March, outside of a hotel in Washington, D.C. And he was arrested for attempted murder, not murder, because because the president didn't die during the act. Now, had the president died later, maybe he would have been charged with murder as well. All right. Lastly, we also crimes against groups. So we have the three that we talk about: crimes against persons, crimes against property, and then crimes against the moral order. And crimes against persons are typically violent crime. Crimes against property are what essentially you understand it to be. And then crimes against the moral order are things that our society has deemed as just bad, inappropriate behavior. It goes strongly against our value system. So crimes like prostitution, gambling, depends on where you are, drug use. I mean, let's be honest, a drug user who uses drugs on themselves, are they hurting other people? You can make the argument, well, they may be hurting their family and friends, sure. But in reality, physically harming people, you're just really harming yourself. You could say the same thing about, drinking or overeating, etc. But we consider drug use to be a crime against the moral order, and so we classify that as a harm. The causation requirement. All right, so this can be a little tricky, and there are some terms in here you need to know. It requires that the actor create the desired result through their efforts. So basically, it's kind of an idea that protects you against unintended consequences. So a guy, here's a classic case in your textbook. You shoot somebody, and they come and they pick him up in an ambulance, and he's on his way to the hospital, and ambulance gets in a wreck, which actually happens more often than people realize. And during that wreck, he dies from his injuries. And so the prosecutor, wanting to make a name for herself, decides, I'm going to charge this guy with murder, not attempted murder, and or aggravated assault. But it really isn't a case of murder because the death was not caused by the bullet. It was caused by the wreck. Now the bullet put him in the ambulance, sure. So we call that proximate cause. So without the bullet, the guy wouldn't have been in the ambulance. But the proximate cause refers to established liability. What that means is that you can be held liable for that guy's death, but that's a civil issue. That's not a criminal issue. You're not going to be charged with the murder. You could be charged with attempted murder. All right. So don't shoot people. Next, mens rea, it's the idea of a guilty mind, and this is where you get into the whole case about lots and lots of information about what is a guilty mind. So we get into when we talk about defense, we'll have 3 or 4 different defense options available. We'll talk about the history of mens rea as well. But right now, I just want you to know you have to understand that what you're doing is wrong. And so on one side, it's a two-sided coin. On the one side of the coin is that you have to be capable of forming a intent to harm. And so we do so in the United States. We argue that the age of mens rea is 7 years old. So normally if you're under 7 and if you committed a crime, we see these horrible stories where maybe a kid picks up a gun, he's 6 years old, finds his dad's gun, he accidentally shoots his kid brother. That's horrible, but that's not a mens rea thing. Universally, the age of mens rea is 14. In the United States, it's 7. The flip side of that coin is that it's not about intent. You have to have the mental intent to form mens rea, but you also have to have the knowledge of the law. And so these are more rare cases, but there's a famous one in 1957, Lambert versus California, United States Supreme Court. Lambert was arrested and charged with failure to register as a convicted felon in the city of Los Angeles. And it was ruled that this case violated, it was a woman, violated her 14th Amendment due process. But the idea was, why did, you have to register as a sex offender, right? So how is this any different? Well, it's different because Los Angeles as a city passed this law, and it didn't necessarily have the authority to do so, and it didn't have the ability to notify others that this was, in fact, something you were required to do. So people moved to Los Angeles. They didn't know the law required them to register as a convicted felon. And people argue, well, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Yes, there's something to that. But in this case, ignorance of the law was, in fact, a Supreme Court-backed 14th Amendment due process. It has to do with, just would a reasonable person expect to believe they needed to register as a convicted felon had they never been told so? And, most cities don't require convicted, in fact, no cities require convicted felons to register. And so the argument here was that, no, the reasonable person standard wouldn't apply. And there was no way this woman could be guilty of failure to registering for a law that she knew absolutely nothing about. So the Supreme Court upheld that. Now, there are some strict liability crimes where mens rea does not apply. And the two big ones are what's called contributing to the delinquency of a minor, i.e. selling alcohol to minors. And then the big one is statutory rape. And that is consensual relations between people, typically between a man and a woman, or it would be a girl, not a woman, when the female is not of the age of consent in that particular state. Okay, the concurrence requirement. And this requires that the criminal act be accompanied by the criminal mind. Your textbook has this example. Throwing a rock at a window, you severely wound a woman by shattered glass. So what was the act? Well, the act, throwing the rock at the window, wasn't, they didn't even know the woman was in there. It was, the intent was just to break the window, and it hurt this woman by unintended consequences. So basically, the woman is wounded, and so, is there criminal liability from her injuries? And the concurrence requirement really requires that the criminal act and the criminal mind be melded together. So the guy threw the rock at the window, it broke the window, and it did injure the woman. He would still be, proximate cause liability would still apply. He would still have to pay her medical bills and all that stuff. But he would probably only be charged with vandalism and not attempted murder. There is an exemption to this. It's called the felony murder exemption, and we'll talk about that on the chapter we talk about on murder later on. The punishment requirement. All right, let's see here. Give me a second. Get to this guy. This is the last one. Basically, the idea here is that you can have an illegal act, you can have an mens rea, an evil mind, but it doesn't matter unless the law subjects it to punishment. Okay? So you have to have so littering, it's a terrible thing, right? It's just classless to throw garbage out your window as you're riding by on the side of the road, etc. They have posted fines for littering. Why is that? Because, people have to understand that it's illegal. Most places in most crimes where there is illegal, there is a posted fine that posts what the punishment is. And so we have three types of violations with punishment. We have felonies, we have misdemeanors, and we have violations. And so a felony is typically something that requires a punishment of imprisonment of a year or more. A misdemeanor can lead to a punishment of less than a year, or typically not for the first offense. So, for example, shoplifting is a misdemeanor. It's typically not a felony, depending on how much you steal. And you could be subject to up to 90 days in jail for shoplifting. Then the last group is violations, where typically it's just a fine. So any of you have ever had a speeding ticket, that's a violation. If you've had a parking ticket, that's a violation. Let me advise you that if you've had parking tickets in any city in Texas, don't forget to pay them, because if you haven't paid them by a certain amount of time, they will swear out a warrant for your arrest, and the next time you're pulled over for speeding, they will haul your butt to jail until that ticket's paid. So you don't want to have to call mom and dad about that. Also, we talked about marijuana use earlier. Violations, ticketing violations. I think now in Texas they're ticketing people for less than 2 ounces of marijuana possession. As opposed to charging you with a misdemeanor and taking you to jail. All right, so we're finished with chapter 1. Those are the 7 acts of the crime. The next chapter is chapter 2, which will start to focus on research and also looking at criminological data on different crimes that are committed and who commits them, etc. What's our trends over time. All right, take care.